The night everything broke open started like any other Tuesday. Lydia set the roasted chicken on the table at exactly 6:47 p.m., the same time she set dinner on the table every single night. The potatoes were golden. The gravy was smooth. The bread rolls were warm from the oven. She had spent 2 hours in that kitchen after a full day of errands, laundry, school pickup, and managing a house that never seemed to stay managed for more than 40 minutes at a time. She lit the 2 candles in the center of the table, a small habit she'd kept since the early years of her marriage, back when candlelight felt romantic instead of just something she did. Her husband Daniel walked in at 6:52 and sat down without looking up from his phone. He was 41, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world was arranged in his favor. He was a senior partner at a mid-size law firm. He wore expensive cologne that Lydia had bought him for their 10th anniversary. He had not thanked her for it. Their daughter Nora, who was 9, climbed into her chair and reached immediately for a bread roll. She was missing one of her front teeth and had a smear of purple marker on her wrist that had survived 2 hand washings. Lydia said softly to wait, then turned back to the stove for the serving spoon, and Nora picked up the roll anyway because no one was watching. Daniel put his phone face down on the table. He surveyed the food. He did not say it looked good. He picked up his fork and tapped it once against the edge of his plate, the way someone taps on a glass to get a room's attention. "The Hendersons are coming for dinner Friday," he said. Lydia sat down. "Oh, you didn't mention that." "I'm mentioning it now." She nodded. The Hendersons were partners at the firm. Richard and his wife Claudette, who had a master's degree in art history and liked to reference it in every conversation. Lydia had always felt like Claudette watched her the way you watch someone struggling to parallel park. Politely patient. Privately entertained. "How many courses are you thinking?" Lydia asked. Daniel shrugged. "Whatever you usually do. Just make it look good. Richard's been talking about his wife's cooking, and I don't want to seem outclassed." Nora was chewing her roll and watching both of them with the practiced invisible attention of a child who has learned that adults reveal things when they forget you're in the room. Lydia began serving. And that's when it happened, the small, ordinary crack that split everything open. She reached across the table for Daniel's plate, and her sleeve caught the edge of the gravy boat. It tipped. Gravy spread across the white tablecloth in a slow brown wave. She grabbed a napkin immediately, pressing it down, saying she was sorry that she'd get it, that it was fine. Daniel pulled his chair back from the spreading stain. He looked at the tablecloth, then at her, with an expression she had seen before, but had never been able to name properly until that exact moment. It was contempt. "God, Lydia." He exhaled through his nose. Can you try to be careful? Can that be a thing you do?" "It was an accident, Daniel. Everything with you is an accident." He stood, dropped his napkin on the table, picked up his phone, and walked out of the dining room without another word. Nora stared at her plate. Lydia blotted the tablecloth. Her hands were very steady. Her face was composed. She had trained both of those things into submission over years and years of practice. But something was different tonight, sitting in that dining room with the candles still burning and one empty chair. Because what Daniel didn't know, what he had never once bothered to find out in 11 years of marriage, was exactly who he had just spoken to that way. And that secret, the one Lydia had kept locked in the quietest corner of her life, was about to become impossible to contain. Lydia had grown up learning to be invisible. It was a skill her mother had taught her, not deliberately, but through the particular architecture of their household. A small apartment above a dry-cleaning shop in a part of the city that people from better zip codes called up and coming for 30 years without it ever actually arriving. Her father worked nights. Her mother worked days. They passed each other like trains on opposite tracks, and Lydia lived in the gap between them, with books and an extraordinary amount of unsupervised thinking time. She had been, quietly and without anyone paying much attention, exceptionally brilliant. Not the loud kind of brilliant that raises its hand and corrects the teacher. The other kind. The kind that sits in the back row and has already read the book twice before the syllabus even assigns it. The kind that builds entire architectures of thought in the spaces between other people's conversations. Her 7th grade math teacher had once handed back a test with a perfect score and written in the margin, "Are you cheating?" Because the idea that a girl from that apartment above that dry-cleaning shop could solve problems that way hadn't fit inside the teacher's understanding of how the world worked. Lydia had not cheated. She had just been good. Extraordinarily, quietly, almost inconveniently good. She was thinking about that teacher now, standing at the kitchen sink after dinner, rinsing plates with the water running a little hotter than necessary, the way she always did when something inside her was simmering. Behind her she could hear Daniel on the phone in his office, the low authoritative timbre of his work voice, so different from the flat dismissive tone he used with her. She could hear Nora in her room, talking to her stuffed animals in the careful serious way she always did before bed, assigning each one a name and a problem she was helping them solve. Lydia turned the faucet off. She stood at the sink with her hands dripping, looking at the window above it, seeing not the dark backyard but her own reflection. A woman in her late 30s, hair pulled back, no jewelry, an apron she'd forgotten to take off. She thought about the folder. The folder she kept in the locked drawer of the antique bureau in the guest bedroom. The one Daniel had never asked about. The one that contained documents so at odds with the life she was currently living that sometimes, late at night, she pulled it out just to confirm they were real. She dried her hands and went to check on Nora. "Mama," Nora said, looking up from her stuffed penguin. "Is Daddy mad at you?" "No, sweetheart." He sounded mad. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed Nora's hair back from her forehead. Sometimes grown-ups sound mad when they're really just tired. Nora considered this with her particular 9-year-old gravity. But what if they're both? Lydia kissed her daughter's forehead and tucked the blanket up under her chin. She turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, because Nora's question was more precise than she knew. The answer was something Lydia had been turning over for weeks. A decision building in the dark the way pressure builds underground, invisible until the ground gives. And Lydia had, just this week, done something she hadn't told anyone about. Something that had set a clock running. Something that, by Friday night, was going to change everything in that house. What exactly she had done? That was the question whose answer was about to rewrite her entire life. To understand what Lydia had done, you have to understand what she had given up. At 19 years old, she had been admitted, with full scholarship, to one of the most competitive doctoral programs in applied mathematics in the country. Not undergraduate. Not a master's program. Doctoral. At 19. The admissions letter arrived on a Thursday. She read it 4 times standing at the mailbox, then folded it neatly into her jacket pocket, and walked to the park 2 blocks from home, and sat on a bench until it got dark. She told no one that night, or the next morning. Because the week before the letter arrived, her mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. And her father, who had never in his adult life stopped working, had finally collapsed from the exhaustion of decades. A minor heart event that the doctors wrapped in cautious, complicated language. Both parents. Same month. Same kitchen she had grown up in. She deferred enrollment for 1 year. The program allowed it. She spent that year managing medications, learning the architecture of the medical system, cooking and cleaning, and keeping the household alive while her parents recovered, and continuing to study because she was constitutionally unable to stop. The 2nd year she deferred again. The 3rd year, the program wrote to tell her the deferment period had expired. She could reapply. She would likely be readmitted. She would need to start from scratch with the application. She began that letter 7 times and never finished it. Because by then she had met Daniel. Daniel Ashworth had come into her life through a mutual friend at a gallery opening she almost hadn't attended. He was charming in the specific way of men who have practiced it. Attentive, funny, just self-deprecating enough to seem trustworthy. He had asked about her life with what felt, at the time, like genuine curiosity. She had not told him about the doctoral program. Not that night, and not on the dates that followed, because he had a way of moving conversations forward, toward himself, toward the future he was building, that made her past feel beside the point. They married within 18 months of meeting. After the wedding she enrolled in a part-time graduate program in mathematics at the City University, telling herself it was a practical compromise, that a different path could still arrive at something true. Then Nora came, and Daniel's career accelerated, and the part-time program became a background hum she kept turning the volume down on, until one day she realized she hadn't opened a textbook in 4 months and Daniel had started calling her schedule her free time. He had never asked, not once, what she had studied before they met. He had never asked what she had wanted. He had simply assumed, and she had let him assume, that she was the woman currently in front of him. Competent, calm, domestic, and uncomplicated. Uneducated was the word he used when he thought she wasn't listening. She had heard him say it to Richard Henderson at a firm event 2 years ago, standing near the bar, his voice carrying easily across the 6 feet between them. Lydia didn't go to college. She's smart in her way, practical, but academia was never her thing. She had been looking at a painting on the wall. She had not corrected him. She had not corrected him that night. But what she had done 2 days ago, quietly, with a phone call she made from the car while Nora was at piano practice, that was a correction of a very different scale. And the person on the other end of that call had said something that made her heart pound so hard, she had to put the car in park and sit there with both hands in her lap, steadying herself against something that felt very much like the future arriving all at once. 2 days ago, at 3:17 in the afternoon, Lydia had called Dr. Evelyn Marsh. Dr. Marsh was the director of the Institute for Mathematical Sciences at Whitmore University, a woman whose name appeared on the cover of 3 textbooks that sat in Lydia's locked drawer alongside the other documents. A woman who, 20 years ago, had written Lydia's original scholarship offer in language, so warm it had felt like being recognized by someone who understood exactly what you were. It had taken Lydia 40 minutes of sitting in that parked car before she finally pressed dial. Dr. Marsh's assistant answered. Lydia gave her name. There was a brief pause, the administrative pause of someone cross-referencing a list, and then the assistant said, "Oh, yes. Please hold." Dr. Marsh picked up within 30 seconds. "Lydia Ashworth," she said, and her voice carried something Lydia hadn't expected. Not surprise. Relief. "I was wondering if you would ever call." Lydia's throat tightened. "You know who I am? My dear, your name is still in the literature. The work you published at 22 is still cited in graduate seminars. I know exactly who you are." The work she published at 22. The 2 papers she had written during her deferred years. Quietly, in the small hours while her parents slept, submitted under her maiden name to peer-reviewed journals, both accepted, both published. A fact she had never mentioned to Daniel, or to anyone in her current life, because by the time they appeared in print she was already becoming someone else entirely. "I've been away from the field," Lydia said carefully. "I know. Your advisor was devastated when you didn't return." A pause. "But that's not why you're calling today, is it?" "No." Lydia looked out the windshield at a pigeon eating something near a yellow parking block. "You posted a visiting fellowship. 6 months. For researchers returning to active study." "I did. I'd like to apply." The silence on Dr. Marsh's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then she said something that changed the entire trajectory of the next 72 hours of Lydia's life. And Lydia, sitting in that parked car, pressed her hand flat against the passenger seat to steady herself, because what Dr. Marsh said next meant that by Friday evening, when the Hendersons arrived for dinner, Lydia would be sitting at that table carrying a secret so enormous it had its own gravitational field. What she hadn't planned, what she could not have anticipated, was that Daniel would find out before she was ready to tell him. Friday arrived with the particular bright cruelty of days that don't know they're important. Lydia was up at 6. She made Nora's lunch, got her on the school bus, then stood in the kitchen with her coffee and her list. The Hendersons were coming at 7. She had 9 hours. She made the pasta dough by hand, prepared the filling, assembled the first course, decanted the wine, and pressed and ironed the white tablecloth. The good one without the gravy stain, which had not come out completely and had been quietly retired to a drawer. She moved through the kitchen the way she moved through most things. Efficiently, precisely, with the focused calm of someone channeling something large into something manageable. At 2 o'clock, Daniel came home early. This was unusual. Daniel did not come home early. His hours were the fixed stars of their household calendar. He walked through the door, set his briefcase down, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work. Something in his posture was different from ordinary tiredness, more alert, more deliberate, like a man who has come home with a purpose. "I ran into Richard at lunch," he said. Lydia continued rolling pasta. "How was that?" "Interesting." He moved to the counter and poured himself a glass of water. "He mentioned something." He said Evelyn Marsh, the director at Whitmore's Math Institute, apparently told someone at the faculty club that she'd spoken this week with the wife of a local attorney about a visiting fellowship. Richard thought it was a funny coincidence because Marsh also mentioned the name. He set his glass down. "Lydia." She looked up. His face was in that particular anterior state, the 5 seconds before the weather changes. "She used your name. Lydia Ashworth. She was talking about a paper you published 20 years ago." He paused. "Would you like to explain what that is?" The pasta dough sat under her palms. She had imagined this moment. She had planned it for the dinner table, with witnesses on her own terms. She had not planned it like this, in her kitchen apron, flour on her wrists, Daniel's eyes doing the cold, quiet calculation she knew too well. But she looked at him across the kitchen and said very calmly, "Yes, I would." And then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Richard Henderson. He held up a finger at her. One finger, the universal signal of a man who has decided his call is more urgent than your explanation, and walked out of the kitchen. Lydia stood at the counter with the pasta dough cooling under her hands. And she made a decision. Not the one she had planned. Something larger. Something she understood, the moment she made it, could not be unmade. She was done telling this story in pieces. She was done letting it be discovered around her. Tonight, at that dinner table with Richard and Claudette Henderson sitting right there, she was going to tell all of it. Every last word. Daniel had married a woman he believed he understood completely. He believed she was warm, capable, good with people, and limited. Limited in the specific way he found comfortable, the way that made him the unambiguous center of gravity in their household. He had not set out to marry someone he could condescend to. He had simply found, over time, that condescension had become the natural climate of their marriage, and he had never once examined why it felt so effortless. What Daniel did not know could fill a filing cabinet. He did not know about the 2 published papers, dense, elegant, serious contributions to the field of applied mathematics, both of which had become, in certain academic circles, quietly canonical. He did not know that a theorem in the second paper bore, in academic shorthand, a version of her maiden name, the Callaway convergence. He did not know that graduate students at universities across 3 continents had wrestled with her work without knowing she existed as a real, living person, because she had published under Lydia Callaway and had then simply vanished from the record. He did not know that Dr. Marsh had told her, on that phone call 2 days ago, that the fellowship wasn't merely available to her. It had, in a very real sense, been designed with researchers like her in mind. Researchers who had made significant early contributions and then disappeared from the field for personal reasons. The stipend was substantial. The position came with a university affiliation and a research budget, and the kind of professional recognition that operated entirely outside the world of Daniel's dinner parties. He did not know that she had, on Thursday morning while he was at work, signed the acceptance letter. He did not know that for the past 3 years, quietly, during school hours and Nora's nap times before that, she had been corresponding with a small informal network of researchers who had sought her out through the published papers, exchanging ideas, reviewing drafts, occasionally contributing to work that appeared in journals she read alone at night with a cup of tea. And he absolutely did not know about the second envelope in the locked drawer. The one that had arrived 3 weeks ago from a foundation in Geneva that awarded prizes, every 2 years, to researchers in pure and applied mathematics. The letter she had read once, carefully, and then placed face down in the drawer because she had not yet figured out what it meant for the life she was living. That envelope had sat there for 3 weeks like a held breath. And tonight, at that dinner table, Lydia had decided, the breath was going to come out. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. They arrived at 7, which meant Richard arrived at 7 and spent the first 10 minutes discussing parking, and Claudette arrived spiritually about 20 minutes later, shedding her coat in the entryway while completing a sentence she had apparently started in the car. She stopped when she saw the table, and for one genuine, unguarded moment her expression broke into something completely unironic. "Oh, Lydia. This is beautiful." The table was. Lydia had used the linen her mother had left her. The candles were tall and cream-colored. The first course, a delicate mushroom consommé with hand-cut pasta threads floating in it like calligraphy, was already plated at each seat, with a small handwritten card beside each bowl indicating the wine pairing. It was the kind of detail that people noticed without knowing why the room felt so composed. They sat. Daniel poured wine. Richard mentioned a verdict from that week, and Daniel responded, and the usual gravitational arrangement of the table organized itself the way it always did at these dinners. The 2 men drawing the conversational center toward themselves while the women orbited. Claudette leaned toward Lydia. "Did you make the pasta yourself?" "Yes. From scratch. The dough's better same day." Claudette looked at her with an expression that was faintly recalibrating. "How long did all of this take?" "About 4 hours, more or less." "God." Claudette shook her head with something approaching respect. "I don't have that patience. Richard says I'm allergic to repetitive tasks." "I find them meditative," Lydia said simply. The courses moved forward. The conversation did what it always did at these dinners, circled eventually toward the question of what Lydia had been up to, the phrase used by people who have already categorized you and are keeping you included out of courtesy. It was Richard who asked. He leaned back with his wine and used the tone of a man ensuring the whole table was engaged. Daniel tells me you keep busy. Home, Nora, all of it. That's really a full-time job in itself. Daniel smiled the smile of a man who considers something settled. Lydia set her fork down. She looked at Richard, then at Claudette, then at Daniel, whose smile had not moved. Actually, she said, I've been meaning to mention something. Daniel's smile held. I accepted a position this week. A visiting fellowship at Whitmore University's Institute for Mathematical Sciences. The table went quiet in the specific way of people who have heard something that doesn't yet fit. That's wonderful, Claudette said, filling the silence with the reflexes of someone socially trained. What does that involve? Research, primarily. I'll be affiliated with the department, have access to the computing resources, and contribute to 2 ongoing projects. The fellowship runs 6 months with the possibility of extension. Richard Henderson had set his wine glass down. Whitmore's math department is a serious program, he said slowly. That's Dr. Marsh's department. Yes. She called me, actually. We'd spoken earlier in the week. She called you? Richard said. And this, right here, was where Daniel made the mistake. The mistake that revealed everything about him in a single sentence. He laughed. It was short and almost reflexive. The laugh of a man confronted with information that doesn't fit his model, and responds by diminishing the information rather than updating the model. Lydia, he said, with the patient, slightly weary tone he used when correcting something, Whitmore's Mathematics Institute is graduate-level research. That's not. He searched for the end of the sentence. I know what it is, she said quietly. I just mean, he was trying to find a frame that contained this comfortably. Did you maybe misunderstand the scope? Maybe it's an outreach program, or... Daniel. Her voice was very calm, the way deep water is calm. I published 2 papers in peer-reviewed mathematical journals when I was 22. One of them introduced a framework that is still in use in graduate programs today. Dr. Marsh cited it in her 3rd textbook. The fellowship is not an outreach program. The table was absolutely still. Richard had both hands around his wine glass and was not moving. Claudette was looking at Lydia the way you look at something you are deeply, suddenly regretting having underestimated. Daniel said nothing. His face was cycling through expressions quickly. I also received a letter 3 weeks ago, Lydia continued, and her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. From the Aldrin Foundation. In Geneva. She watched Richard Henderson's face change at the name. Even Claudette's posture shifted. They award a prize every 2 years for contributions to pure and applied mathematics. One of the nomination committee members wrote to confirm my address. Because someone had submitted my work for consideration. She looked at Daniel directly and without performance. I'm on the shortlist. The dining room was so quiet that one of the candles was audible, a tiny flicker of sound in all that silence. And Daniel's face, the face of a man who had called his wife smart in her way to a colleague, who had laughed 30 seconds ago at the idea that she might belong in a serious institution. That face had lost, for the first time since she had known him, every trace of its confidence. Lydia picked up her fork and continued eating. Richard Henderson recovered first, because lawyers always do. He leaned forward and brought his full attention, the specific focused attention he reserved for things that genuinely mattered, to bear on Lydia. The Aldrin Foundation shortlist, he said carefully. You're saying you've been nominated. The letter uses the word shortlisted, she said. The formal nominations are still being reviewed. That prize is internationally recognized, he said. He glanced at Daniel briefly, then back to Lydia in a way that communicated something quickly. The recipients, in mathematics circles, that prize is. I know what it is, she said again. Gently this time. Claudette reached across the table and put her hand on Lydia's. The gesture was entirely instinctive, and it surprised both of them. How long have you been carrying this? Claudette asked. The nomination? 3 weeks. No, I mean. Claudette looked at her husband and then back. All of it. How long have you been carrying all of it? Lydia considered the question honestly. 11 years, more or less. Though I was carrying it before the marriage. I've been carrying it since I was 19 and decided other things mattered more at the time. What changed? Richard asked. She looked at Daniel. He was sitting very still at the head of his own dinner table, in the house where he had been the unquestioned authority for over a decade, and the structure of him was shifting in a way that had no clean resolution. A few things, Lydia said. A spilled gravy boat, among other things. Nora was at a friend's house for the night. That was something Lydia had arranged deliberately days earlier, because she had known that something was going to happen at this table, and she had wanted her daughter far from it. Daniel cleared his throat. The sound was smaller than his throat clearings usually were. Why didn't you tell me? The question was stripped of its usual authority. It was just a question. I tried once, she said. Early on. I mentioned the papers. You were on a call, and when you hung up you said sorry. What were you saying? And I said never mind. And I never tried again. Daniel stared at the tablecloth. I think, Lydia said carefully, not cruelly, you were very comfortable with who you thought I was. And I was very tired. Comfort and tiredness, when they live in the same house long enough, tend to make the truth feel like too much effort. I never called you uneducated, he said. She looked at him. The specific look of a woman who has a very precise memory, and is choosing not to deploy it in front of witnesses. He stopped. Richard Henderson picked up his wine and said, with the care of a man who understands exactly how much a sentence can carry. I'd like to hear about the research, Lydia. If you're willing. And this was the door she had kept closed for 11 years. She opened it. She talked about the research the way she occasionally talked to the colleagues in her informal working group. Precisely, fluently, with the ease of someone for whom this is not learned vocabulary but native language. She talked about the project at Whitmore, and the computational challenges, and the approach she believed might resolve one of the framework's current limitations. Richard listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered. Claudette listened with open, unguarded fascination. Daniel listened with the face of a man who is understanding, for the first time, that he has been living in a house with someone he does not know at all. When she finished, the table was quiet in a different way than before. Not the silence of shock. The silence of people who have witnessed something real and need a moment to hold it properly. Richard said quietly, You should have been doing this the whole time. Yes, Lydia said. I should have. That was when Daniel looked up from the tablecloth. The expression on his face was not just shame, though shame was in it. It was something older and more complicated. The grief of a person who has held something extraordinary in his hands every day and called it ordinary, and who is understanding now, all at once, that those years are not recoverable. He opened his mouth. But what he said, and what passed between them after the Hendersons left, that was not something that resolves at a dinner table. That required a different room, a later hour, and the most honest conversation Lydia had been part of in over a decade. The Hendersons left at 11. Richard shook Lydia's hand at the door, not the social handshake he'd given her at every prior event, but something more formal, the kind exchanged between equals. Claudette hugged her, which neither of them had done before. The faculty club hosts a lecture series, Claudette said quietly at the door. I'm on the committee. I'd like to have you speak. Lydia said she'd like that. Then the door closed and it was just the two of them in the house, alone in the way that matters, not just physically alone, but without the social architecture that usually held them at a managed distance from each other. She began clearing the table. Daniel came to help without being asked, which he had not done in a very long time. They worked in silence, plates, glasses, the linen that needed soaking. The ordinary choreography of a kitchen being put in order after a dinner that had been anything but ordinary. Then he said quietly, Tell me about the papers. She set down the serving dish she was holding and looked at him. Please, he added. She told him. Not all of it, not in that 1 hour, but the bones of it. The doctoral admission. Her parents' illnesses. The 2 deferred years. The papers she'd written in the small hours while her parents slept in the next room, submitted under her maiden name, published in journals she had found at the university library because she could not stop herself from working even when her life had collapsed around her. The scholarship letter. The acceptance she had never sent. The particular grief of watching a door you never quite decided to close disappear behind you anyway. He listened in a way she did not recognize from him. He did not reframe. He did not move forward. He just listened, the way you listen when you know you have no right to do anything else. When she stopped, he said, I've been very stupid. Yes, she said. Not unkindly. Not just about this. No, not just about this. He sat down at the kitchen table, their ordinary kitchen table, not the dinner table with the candles, just the one where Nora did her homework and they drank their coffee in the mornings without talking, and looked at his hands. The thing you said at dinner. About me saying you were uneducated. The Callaway Group event. You said I was smart in my way, she said. 2 years ago. You were standing near the bar with Richard. He flinched. I remember. Do you remember what I did when I heard you say it? He looked up. I looked at a painting on the wall, she said. And I decided not to correct you. And I want you to understand why, because I think that's the more important question. Not why you said it. Why I let you. He waited. Because I had spent so many years making myself smaller than I was that I had almost started to believe it. There was always a part of me that knew the truth. But that part had been quiet for a very long time. And I let it stay quiet because I was afraid of what would happen if I let it speak. If I let you see who I actually was, and you still didn't value it, that felt like a worse thing than staying invisible. The kitchen was very quiet. I want to know who you actually are, he said. I know that might be a thing I've lost the right to ask. She looked at him for a long time. You haven't lost the right to ask, she said finally. But asking is only the beginning. The next part is harder. I know. You don't yet. But you will. She filled a glass of water and set it in front of him and stood at the counter. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was dark, someone's porch light burning a block over like a small warm signal in all that dark. She thought about Nora. About the careful, precise intelligence with which her daughter watched both of her parents every day, and the model of marriage and womanhood and intellectual life that was being built, without any commentary, in her daughter's mind. That thought, more than any dinner table, more than any fellowship or nomination or prize, was what had finally made keeping the secret impossible. There's one more thing, Lydia said. Daniel looked up. The Aldrin Foundation shortlist. They've asked for a phone interview in 3 weeks. If I make the final list, the prize includes a residency. For months. In Geneva. She looked at him directly. Nora would need to come with me. And I would need you to support that. Not manage it from a distance. Actually support it. You'd need to restructure your schedule. For 4 months, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. And then he said something she had not anticipated. Something that came from a part of him she had not seen in years. Maybe had not seen since before the marriage became what it had become. It cracked through the careful structure she'd built around herself and let the air in, the way cold air sometimes does. The only thing that confirms you're still breathing. She had expected to feel triumphant at some point during this evening. She had expected revelation to feel like victory. What she actually felt was something far more complicated and far more real. The specific fragile feeling of being fully seen for the first time, which is its own kind of vertigo. She steadied herself against the counter. And she understood that whatever came next was going to require a version of courage entirely different from anything she had practiced before. Not the courage of keeping a secret, the courage of building something open in plain sight with no locked drawer to retreat to. 3 weeks later, Lydia sat in the guest bedroom at the antique bureau she had owned since before her marriage. The drawer was open. The folder was on the desk in front of her. She had just finished the phone call with the Aldrin Foundation Selection Committee. 40 minutes, 3 panel members, questions about her published work and her current research direction and her plans for the Whitmore Fellowship. She had answered each question the way she answered mathematical problems. Directly, precisely, without hedging. When the call ended, she sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. Then she opened the folder. The 2 published papers, their edges slightly worn from years of handling. The original scholarship letter, still sharp in its language. The acceptance letter she had written for the doctoral program and then never sent, a document she had kept for reasons she had never fully examined. Beneath all of it, a photograph slightly creased at one corner. A girl of 19 sitting at a library table surrounded by open textbooks, completely absorbed, completely unaware of being photographed. Her mother had taken it through the library window on a visit she'd made to campus once, just to see where her daughter spent her days. Lydia looked at the girl in the photograph for a long time. At the open books. At the total absorption. At the complete unawareness of anyone watching. Then she took the photograph out of the folder and set it on the desk beside the new letter from Whitmore confirming her start date. 2 weeks away. She heard Daniel on the stairs. He knocked on the guest bedroom door, which he had not done before, because he was trying, genuinely, imperfectly, with the specific effort of a man who is accustomed to being right and is learning to be uncertain, to do things differently. Trying because of what she had asked of him at the kitchen table that night. And because of what Nora had said to him over breakfast the morning after the dinner, looking up from her cereal with her particular 9-year-old gravity. "Daddy, did you know Mama is really smart?" And he had said yes, sweetheart. And he had meant it for the first time. "Come in," Lydia said. He opened the door and saw the open folder, the photograph, the letters arranged on the desk. He stood in the doorway and looked at the girl in the photograph with the focused attention she'd seen him give to his most important cases. "Is that you?" he asked. "Yes." "At 19? "Yes." He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. "The committee called?" "Yes." "And?" She looked at him. She thought about 11 years of quiet. About flour on her wrists and a gravy-stained tablecloth, and a painting she had stared at while deciding not to speak. About Mrs. Patton's margin note, and the mailbox where the scholarship letter arrived, and the park bench where she'd sat until the sky went dark. About the Callaway Convergence, named in academic shorthand after a girl who had gone silent for a decade and a half, but had never, not entirely, stopped. "They want to move forward," she said. "I'm on the final list." The sound Daniel made was not sophisticated. It was not the sound of a lawyer or a dinner party host, or the man who had laughed at the thought of her belonging somewhere serious. It was something more unguarded than all of that, something that sounded, around its edges, like relief on her behalf. Like a man watching a door open that he had not realized, until this moment, he had helped to close. She nodded. She picked up the photograph of the 19-year-old, and looked at her one last time. Then she set it carefully on top of the pile, closed the folder, and stood. There was work to do. Real work, the kind she had kept in a locked drawer. There were problems waiting for her at the exact coordinates where she had left them, patient as mathematics always is, not diminished by neglect, not altered by the years, simply there, as true as they had always been, waiting for the mind that understood them to come back. She picked up her laptop. She walked past Daniel, who stepped aside in the doorway. She went downstairs to the ordinary kitchen table and opened a new document. At the top, she typed 2 words. Lydia Callaway. Her name. Her actual, complete, unabbreviated name. The one on the papers, the one in the footnotes, the one the selection committee had confirmed 3 times on the call, the one some graduate student somewhere would look up one day and find attached to work that had outlasted her silence by years. She looked at the name on the screen for a moment. Then she flexed her fingers, settled into her chair, and began.